All right, guys. Jordan and I are back. I don't know who the guys are. I guess it's everybody that's listening, is what I mean by
People.
that. People. Um, we're we're going to talk about why you should start training early for each hunting season. And I guess that probably sounds nice coming from two guys that run a hunting training operation, but it's the truth. And that's why we do the things we do the way that we do them because um, well, things take time. I guess we can start there. I don't that's all of the adaptations and the things that we're going to talk about today. Like it just things take time, and that's the first like top level thing to say. And then what are all the things that we're going to consider while we talk about this, Mr. Wilcher, Mr. Jordan Wilcher of Reno, Nevada?
With the sciencey stuff that you're going to talk about, the things that had written down were folks' training age, their biologic age, and any injuries, kind of restraints, anchors that they might have already, and for people to understand that they need to take those into account also.
Okay, let's start with the training age thing before we talk about it. Like all of the so I think that what happens a lot of times is people are like, well, I'm already aerobically pretty fit, or I'm already pretty strong. These types, I don't need to do this type of a training block right now because I've already done this. So, for example, let's say somebody's got decent endurance. So, looking at what we're doing right now with the current training block, where we do a lot of cardiac output training, and a lot of extensive strength training, they might look at that and say, "Oh, well, I've already done a bunch of that. I don't need that." And and the truth is like you can come back to that and are able to access it more because of the adaptations that you've developed, and it will still improve your fitness. You will still increase your capabilities. Um, and so I just wanted to address that first because I've done these training cycles for years and I still go back through the same things. And you also have to keep in mind that like just because you've established an adaptation, it doesn't just stay there. Like you still need stimulus to maintain it. So coming back and giving each of those things a developmental type stimulus each year not only is going to build fitness, it's going to maintain what you have. And so even if your training age is high, working through the different training blocks throughout the year is going to help you continue to build on the foundation that you already have.
Yeah. And just doing not hammering away at these things, but people like we see get better and better and better every year. So doing, like you're saying, a little bit at a time, to maintain that. But really we see people continue to grow. I
Yeah.
think we were talking about before, looking at people's aerobic fitness that have been in the program for a while, and they're like starting the year in an immensely aerobically fit place,
Yeah.
just
Yep.
from that, keeping kind of coming back and, like you say, pressing that button when we need to. And it's not this cyclical, I get in shape this year and then the season comes and I fall out. It's like these people, it's January and these people are in fantastic shape right now.
Yeah. Which will allow them to do even more of the specific work that we do over the summer and get more out of it. And that's one of the reasons for like the training blocks, because if you look now, it's a very endurance focused type training block. And then we'll move on to a max strength and aerobic power type training block. And then we'll have our specific training block. And then we'll go back into like a strength and maintenance type block during hunting season. And this allows us to give these different doses of the different types of training throughout the year. And so that that way I was thinking and trying to talk at the same time, so I stopped myself. You also don't burn out on a single stimulus. Whereas a lot of people think they're like, well, they just hammer the same stimulus. Like endurance people will just hammer that. People that are already strong will try to stick what they're good at and they'll just hammer that. And they won't get enough of the other stimulus to make themselves really as well rounded as possible. Because if you look at what we're trying to do, we're basically trying to have as much general work capacity as possible, because that's really what's required of us when we hunt. Now there's the specific capacity of being able to move under load efficiently for a long time when it comes to things like hiking, packing in, packing out, all of that kind of stuff. But mostly what we need to do is develop a lot of general work capacity. And there are different aspects of fitness that contribute to that. And the first one is movement capacity and mobility. The second is relative strength. The third is aerobic capacity. And the fourth is aerobic power. So all of these things that make whatever we do cost our body less. They conserve energy, because if you're relatively stronger, everything you do requires less output from your nervous system. If you have a lot of aerobic capacity, you can do things for a really long time. And if you can make your aerobic system work fast with aerobic power, you don't tap as much into your anaerobic energy systems, which make you tired much, much faster. You run out of fuel with those much, much faster. So that is really what we're trying to do. But you can't, while we do things concurrently, so that means training different qualities at the same time, the amount of each dose changes. And so you have to develop those in layers. So you have to give your body different doses of each one, because you can't just train them all at max developmental volume. It just won't work, because you'll be giving your body too much. It won't adapt. And then the second thing to consider within all of that is that your certain adaptations have to come before other ones. And we'll get into the specifics of those in just a minute. So regardless of if you already have a training age that's high, you still need to follow this kind of setup, because that's what you're going to get most out of it. And then if you have a young training age, the biggest thing I think with that is expectation and skill acquisition. And we'll talk about that with strength training even more, because one of the reasons to start strength training so early is because it takes a pretty fair amount of time to acquire the skill you need to be able to get the intensity of a movement that you can get out of it. So that's another reason to start off this process as early as possible. What do you got to add to that? Where are you at?
No, I think that's great. I think addressing the skill component, especially with the novice, and getting that time to develop skills with movements and that sort of thing, so that people are in a place where they can train with decent intensity without, risk of injury. And also just the better your movement and the better you're able to execute a given exercise, the more you're going to get out of it, versus being a big sloppy mess.
Yeah.
So I think I think those are both very good points regarding training age and why this applies to any training age.
Yeah. And the thing to consider too is people with a young training age they will respond quickly to training.
Yeah, to everything.
So I could put you on a bike for 5 minutes and your max bench press is going to go up, just non-specific, whatever you have. But what you can't avoid the fact that everything takes time to develop. So the initial adaptations to aerobic or strength development take somewhere between 8 to 12 weeks. Sometimes some things take up to 14 weeks. But that doesn't mean that it's at the peak of its development. You just need at least that much time,
Right.
And you look at people that are, let's say, endurance athletes, they continue to improve some of these mechanisms for years
and
years. So just because you give yourself 8 to 12 weeks doesn't mean you're done. That's the baseline. Now we can start to layer things on top of that. So that's just another reason to consider why you can't start too late. Because listen, if you're somehow listening to this and the summer's about to start and you're like, oh, well, it's too late. It's not too late. You can still do things intelligently and start now and get what you can. But right now it's January 24th, 2023. If you start now, you're going to be in way better shape than you would be if you start in the summer. But it's never too late to start, but you should start as early as possible.
Yeah. And having the understanding of, if you're starting at a given time like that, close to season or whatever, it would not be wise to be starting doing crazy anaerobic stuff or, crazy cardiac power stuff if you haven't really done much of your other aerobic development. Or same with strength work. Like, if you're not moving very good, it's not going to be wise to jump into very intense strength training, knowing that you have this short specific amount of time you still have to start at a place where it's going to be foundational to your fitness moving forward, not like, well, I don't have that much time, so I'm just going to cram the hard shit in here.
Yeah, it won't work. It won't work.
Right.
You won't. The crazy thing is you won't be as fit as you would be. You think you would be fitter, like you think
Yeah.
you would accelerate it. You won't be as fit as if you would have just done the stuff you should have been doing at the correct pace. You'll still be in better shape. And if you do, you'll likely burn out. If you
Yeah.
try to do that, you're going to crush yourself, and you're just not going to adapt because you don't have the raw materials to adapt to what you're trying to do. So, should we do science stuff now? You want to jump in with that?
Sure.
All right. So the first thing that we're gonna talk about is cardiac output trainings, which is a big basis of what we're doing. Almost every now, almost every stimulus that we give during this training block could affect cardiac output. Now, the problem with cardiac output is the amount of blood your heart pumps out with a beat. That's it. And so when you do that type of training, what we want to have happen is eccentric ventricular hypertrophy, especially your left ventricle, specifically your left ventricle. That's where you're going to see the adaptation. So you have to have your heart rate at a certain range such that there's enough blood pulling in that ventricle that it stretches. And then that causes it to pump out more blood with each beat. Now, the crazy thing about that is this type of training, because of the stroke volume, because of the other adaptations that you have to it, it biases you towards parasympathetic instead of sympathetic. So parasympathetic is your rest and digest system. Sympathetic is, they're both parts of your autonomic nervous system, but sympathetic then is your fight or flight nervous system. It biases towards you parasympathetic and helps you shift faster because it increases your vagal tone. We don't need to go too deep into that, Rotherham, but so we'll just start with the high level thing that it biases you towards being parasympathetic, which means that you can shift faster. So like when you're doing a hard workout, you're sympathetic. What we want to do to recover as fast as possible after that is be able to shift towards parasympathetic. And the more you do aerobic capacity type training, cardiac output training, the better you will be at flipping that switch and shifting towards rest and digest from sympathetic inputs such as like a hard workout or a hard hike or something like that. So some of the things that happen associated with that and the adaptations. So major cardiac remodeling. So what we were talking about with the eccentric ventricular hypertrophy, 6 to 9 months. You're going to have adaptations before that, but like to get the most out of it, 6 to 9 months.
And I think it's an important distinction. If people are like Googling these things, the ventricular hypertrophy that you see in people with chronic hypertension, these other things, is the cardiac remodeling is entirely different.
Yes.
And makes the heart hypoplastic versus with what you're talking about, where the ventricle, the inner diameter gets bigger versus the outer diameter getting bigger and the inner diameter getting smaller. With if 9 out of 10 probably or more Google searches that are about left ventricular hypertrophy are going to be about sick people.
Right.
Just an important distinction. If somebody's going like, what is this? And they look at that and go, oh my God, that's bad.
Yeah. It's also a different, thank you for doing that. It's also different from the cardiac remodeling that you get from weightlifting. So weightlifting will make the external walls of your heart thicker a lot of times. So you have to consider that we have to battle that. The similar adaptation to a hypertension adaptation, because
right, that's what
weightlifting
happens.
is hypertension. It creates hypertension.
Insane hypertension, right? Yeah. Like more than people would even fathom.
Yeah. So another reason to do cardiac output, especially if you're mostly a strength athlete, is it will likely increase your lifespan because you won't have the same kind of cardiac problems.
Yeah, right. What are the only athletes that live longer than the general population? They're endurance athletes. Right. No other athlete has an extended lifespan compared to that they've studied anyway.
And it has to do with the cardiac remodeling. It has to do with the ability to shift vagal tone. And it also has to do with the things that we see in the actual blood vessels. So you have, in the course of about 8 weeks, you'll increase capillary growth. So capillary are the smallest of your blood vessels, and that's where all of the nutrient and oxygen transfer comes from. So what happens is you increase the amount of blood that your heart pumps out. Well, that blood has to have a place to go. And so the increased capillary density is a product of that. Otherwise, the cardiac output's not going to help you because you need more surface area for nutrient transport, and you need the system to have more space for the increased blood because your blood volume increases as well. And so you increase capillary density. So that's going to mean that as you recover, as you shift back towards parasympathetic, you're going to have more nutrient transfer into your tissues. You also, while you're training, you'll have more oxygen that you're able to uptake into your muscles. And then once we work on like aerobic power, you'll be able to use that oxygen more efficiently and faster. So we look at that. So if you look at major cardiac remodeling, 6 to 9 months, you're going to have adaptations you'll have immediate adaptations, but to really get them to start to happen, 8 to 12 weeks. Then from there, we're increasing mitochondrial density with this type of training. So in our block, if you look at the cardiac output training itself, so our different means of doing that with our zone 2 circuits, with the blood flow restriction training, with the tempo training, all are going to increase mitochondrial density. So it typically takes about 6 weeks to see a significant change there. Some studies say 2 weeks, but you're really looking at around at least 6 weeks to get a significant change. Okay. More like 8 to 12 to get it all. And then, so once you have the mitochondrial density, you've increased mitochondria, then you can increase mitochondrial respiration, which is what comes from aerobic power training. So we essentially make the system work faster, but you can't make a system work faster that's not completely built, right? So we need this time to get these adaptations. We were talking about the endurance athletes and why they might live longer. We're talking about the central cardiac adaptations, but also arterial diameter increases while wall thickness decreases because the blood has to have somewhere to go. And it just makes it more elastic rather than more rigid, right? Because you're pumping out more blood, it needs a place to go. So that takes around 3 months. So if you're looking at this timeline, 12 weeks is all looking around like 12 weeks is that sweet spot for these things to really start to happen. Okay. And then once we have this, we can start to layer on top of it with the other things that we're going to need. Because I know that people, like, they look at training like this, or they try to, like, man, other than the strength training this time around, which isn't super easy because high intensity continuous training is difficult in its own way. Tempo training is difficult in its own way. And so is use training. But the conditioning during this phase doesn't feel difficult, and it shouldn't. Yeah. And I think that's where people look at this and they're like, oh man, well, this isn't like an uphill. This isn't what I'm going to need. I need this harder stuff. It's like, you have to do this stuff to make it easier. Well, to make the uphills easier, they will regardless, but also to give you the raw materials that you need to train for the uphills. We got to accrue this volume of training first. So we get these different adaptations, like more blood volume pumped out with each beat, more capillary density, so you have the nutrient transfer. Doing this type of training so you increase the amount of mitochondria your muscle tissue has so that we can make it work faster. But if you don't have these adaptations, you're not going to be able to build the speed or the power of the system that you want to build. And as you look at that right now, we started this training at the beginning of this month, right? 12 weeks puts us at the end of March, right? And so now we have plenty of time to do a phase or a block of training that increases max output, right? Aerobic power. And then we have plenty of time to do a block that helps us peak from that. But if we didn't start now, we won't be able to access all of those things as well as we'd like to access them.
Yeah. And looking at these things over time, you can understand how just progression of these different stimulus, it makes it easier, right? Training is easier. It's not like you're saying the aerobic work, and like we're doing aerobic work right now, but it's not like, oh my God, this is going to hurt so bad.
Oh yeah.
Aerobic power type stuff. By the time you get to it, because like aerobic power training, does it hurt? Like, yeah, it hurts. Like it's not comfortable, or at least, but you're not in this place where you're untrained and you're jumping into some leg searing horrible
Yeah.
thing. You're getting to this place where you've already done a fair amount of aerobic work that wasn't um, to that level of intensity. And so it's not the same as when you're jumping in and then trying to go and do sprints or
Oh
something that
yeah.
people feel like is climbing a hill and they're almost, I think, like looking for a feeling. And
Yeah.
it's like we're looking at how are you put together and what's going to make you better, not, well, the last time you went up a hill, you were out of shape and your legs hurt really bad. And so keep training like that.
Yeah.
You know,
Exactly.
not not
Yeah.
doing that.
And you got to stop chasing feelings. That's the first thing.
Yes.
It's if you're chasing a feeling, you're never going to make the progress that you need to make. It's you got to do the right things at the right time and in the right sequence. And that's I've seen it at every level of every person I've ever trained is like people that chase the feeling. And far be it for me to judge them, because it's like sometimes you just don't know any better and you feel like
Yeah.
this is the feeling that you need to replicate. Well, you can avoid the intensity of that feeling if you do
Yeah.
things in the proper way. And another thing to keep in mind with, like you said about the that aerobic power training hurts, and it absolutely does, and it's never not going to hurt.
Exactly.
But the thing about it is, if you don't have these other adaptations built first, you won't recover from it fast enough to be able to maintain the volume that it takes to improve that level of your fitness, because you just won't have your recovery system built. Like we said, having developed doing the aerobic capacity cardiac output type training changes your vagal tone. It makes you more parasympathetic. It makes it easier for you to flip that switch. And if you don't have that developed, you will go and do these intense sessions and you just won't recover from them as faster, or you won't
Right.
be able to handle the amount of volume, because it helps you switch from parasympathetic, sympathetic to parasympathetic between sets, and then
Yes.
also between sessions.
Absolutely. When you're talking about those intervals and getting, we have criteria for where somebody's heart rate needs to get to in between, those types of things. And if you're doing the work, like you want to recover as much as possible before the next set starts, because otherwise, I mean, if you weren't in a place that you could do that, all we would see is your heart rate would progressively go higher and higher and higher and higher and higher. We wouldn't see it cycle up and down the way that it's supposed to.
Right.
We would just see you just pin that sucker to the top and get to a point then where you probably just couldn't finish the workout like you needed
Yeah.
to develop that adaptation.
Well, and you're also not, yeah, you're not going to do aerobic power. You're going to end up doing a
Mhm.
lot of anaerobic training. You're going to be just sitting there in some kind of an acid bath, just burning. It's just not going to be fun. It's going to be worse. So you just won't be able to get the things that you want, or you'll
Right.
have to do it at such a low volume and such a low frequency and such a low intensity that you won't develop the fitness that you actually
Exactly.
want to develop. So we need these things first.
Mhm.
Um, as far as strength training goes, like we talked about earlier, the first thing is like skill acquisition. So unless there are certain things that just, that's one of the reasons that we don't, like we train that essentially the same Rolodex of exercises, just applied with different contexts of volume and intensity.
Mhm.
Because if you constantly have to learn weird new shit all the time, that some of these other things that might do to entertain you, you can't apply the same intensity. Skill acquisition allows you to apply intensity. And especially if you're on a rotation throughout the year that includes the same exercises, but maybe some in different frequency as others, it gives you the chance to maintain that skill. But also some of it is going to degrade. It's a, like
Yeah.
all of the people talk about shooting and everything, they're perishable skills. And so you need refreshers of those. And so starting early allows you to get back into that skill acquisition that allows you to apply intensity. So if you want to be able to go into a max strength and max aerobic power phase later, well, you have to have your skill acquisition up, or you're never going to get the most out of that session, because you won't be able to apply the same level of intensity. You just won't be able to
Right.
do it. So we have to start early for skill acquisition. And then the same thing with strength, like these longer term adaptations, they take 8 to 12 weeks. So tissue restructuring. So I mean, you're going to get initial tissue and neurological adaptations in about 4 weeks. Muscle
Yeah,
size
quick.
depends. Yes, muscle size depends. But like rate of force development, like how fast you can develop force and display it, that's going to take like 14 weeks. So we're giving you a strength stimulus now and then a more intense strength stimulus in a few months, but that all counts towards the full development. And so if you look at the end of that, you're looking at like 24 weeks of strength development in varying ways. So extensive
Hmm.
strength to intensive strengths. Extensive is like being able to display strength over time and multiple outputs, and where intensive strength is just like how much force can you generate at one time. And so you're looking at 24 weeks of development rather than just doing like, well, I'm going to do this program 8 to 12 weeks before I ship out. You just can't develop to the point that you otherwise would.
Yeah.
And so the biggest thing is these things take time. You can't, they're not instant. You can't just jump in and do your HIIT classes and lift heavy and get out of this what you need. First of all, for longevity, because you look at, like we talked about, the endurance athletes and the health ramifications of it, but also the longevity of your hunt and being able to repeat the same output day after day after day. The biggest compliment that we get from people that go hunt is they're like, oh man, I woke up the next day and I
Yeah.
expected to be sore and not be able to go as hard. And I wasn't. I could go and do the same
Yeah.
things. Like I
Day
never,
3, I felt great.
still felt great. And just like Carolyn that just got back from New Zealand, she hiked over 100 miles in like a few weeks, and she could just repeat and repeat and repeat and repeat and repeat because of doing things in the sequence with which we do them. And so to create that, we'll just call it inner trip repeatability. So you still have the same access to the fitness that you've had throughout the trip. You have to layer your adaptations.
Yeah. And I think, like you said, this points toward the long-term goal of like continued fitness and well-being far into the future.
Yeah.
And then once you see, you know, we're defining fitness essentially with this podcast, right? We're saying this is what it takes to build fitness. These things is how much time it takes for what we do.
Yeah.
And then once you have people that are a year or whatever into that, 2 years, 3 years, um, they just continue to improve. They're not going through this cycle where they're starting over all the time,
Yes.
because as you can see laid out, like if you're going to do it right, that's a big task to do every year, to like start from like, well, I just let my fitness fall off and I'm going to try to, you're not going to be able to achieve that by just training for 2 months per year before your hunt. You're not going to be as well rounded as you could be, like you said. But if you do it right and you don't burn people out,
Yeah.
you get somebody training consistently for 24 months instead of 8 weeks, you can obviously glean that those people are going to be in a pretty damn good place.
Yeah. Well, it becomes part of who you are,
Yeah.
and then you see how worthy the investment is, both from your time and your effort, and then the money that you spend on it. Like you see how it plays forward in your life, and if you want to be doing what we do when you're eligible for the senior citizen discount at Denny's, like
Hell yes.
you got you got to do this shit now, man. Like and continue to cyclically work on your fitness. And by that I mean the layering approach that we take, from work capacity to output to peak to maintenance, like throughout the year. And if you do that every year, you will get fitter, but you'll also maintain things in such a way that you'll be able to do this for the rest of your life and not have to worry about the other things that people do, or that start to get older. You'll do this for much, much, much longer, or be able to enjoy whatever it is that you want to enjoy
Yeah.
when you're
Anything.
75, so
Yeah. Because, I mean, we're talking about capability ultimately is what we want, right? For people out in their outdoor endeavors, like we
yeah.
want them to have big capability. And it's, it's a thing that, I don't think anybody could look at and say like, well, nah, I don't want to be that capable,
Yeah.
Um, but that being said, we also, what we don't talk about as much is we have a lot of ways to keep people engaged throughout this, because if you hear this, you're like, man, I got to do the same stuff over and over again. It's like, well, you do, right? You're doing these same things over and over again, but there's ways to make it enjoyable, and
Well,
to vary
yeah.
certain things that, we're not just like plugging the same thing in on repeat every single
Oh
year.
no. And you're also seeing changes every month, and then you're
Yeah.
seeing bigger changes every 3 months,
Hmm.
to continue to develop. But also, yeah, the monotony, like we talked about at the end of last summer, like going into the fall, like we needed a break from
Absolutely.
the not only the physical intensity but the mental intensity of our training. Like we took the fall to just lift some weights, maintain the things that we need to do, and we didn't talk about mental skills or all of these other things that take this innate intense amount of focus, because it's like sometimes you just need a break. You can't do developmental amounts of volume of everything year round. You can't. You just need a break from things. So
Yeah, I think that's an important piece into keeping people on track to where they can have this place where they're going to take this big chunk of time, like you said, 24 weeks or whatever, to grow this stuff. It's an investment for sure.
it is. Um, that feels like a good place to cut her. But before we go, right now it is January 24th. So if you're listening to this in real time, we have registration open for Backcountry Ready off season right now. We're doing we reopened enrollment, but it closes on the 27th, and we start testing on Monday the 30th. And so I'm gonna put the link for registration in the show notes, so you can click that. You can learn all about the program, and then what you're going to do once you learn all about the program is you're going to click the button to register, because you and I both know it's the right thing to do.
It is.
All right, so I'll put that in the show notes, and we'll see you guys next time.